While the United States wages economic war on China, while Russia bleeds in Ukraine, while Europe scrambles for energy, and the dollar-dominated order cracks under its own weight, one nation is watching, calculating, and making every major power come to its door. That nation is India, and it is not choosing sides, it is choosing itself. The post-1945 world order, built on American military supremacy, dollar hegemony, and the liberal institutional framework of the UN, WTO, and IMF, is under unprecedented stress. Russia's invasion of Ukraine fractured Europe and deepened the NATO-Russia divide. China's economic rise challenged American technological and manufacturing dominance. The Global South began rejecting the conditions attached to Western-led finance, and the rules-based international order, long championed by Washington, started looking less like a system of fairness and more like a system of control. In the middle of this unraveling, India, a nation of 1.4 billion people, the world's fifth largest economy, and a historical practitioner of non-alignment, is executing a foreign policy strategy that baffles Western analysts and frustrates Beijing alike. It is called strategic autonomy, and it might be the most powerful geopolitical playbook of the 21st century. To understand India's position, you need to understand what is actually breaking. For 7 decades, the world ran on what scholars call the Pax Americana, the American peace. The United States provided military security for its allies, maintained freedom of navigation in global sea lanes, anchored the international financial system through the dollar, and enforced a set of rules. Imperfect, yes, but broadly stable. That architecture is now under simultaneous assault from multiple directions. In the economic domain, China built its manufacturing dominance by exploiting the rules of the WTO, rules it then resisted applying to itself. The United States, under both Trump and Biden, began treating trade as a weapon rather than a framework. Tariffs, export controls, sanctions, the language of economic coercion replaced the language of comparative advantage. In the security domain, NATO's expansion eastward and Russia's violent response to it produced a war in Europe not seen since 1945. The resulting sanctions on Russia disconnected a major energy and commodity supplier from Western financial systems. Suddenly, the infrastructure of global finance, SWIFT, the dollar clearing system, correspondent banking, was revealed to be a weapon, and every nation in the world took note. In the technological domain, the contest between American and Chinese semiconductor ecosystems created a bifurcation. Nations were being asked, whose chips will you use? Whose telecommunications infrastructure? Whose cloud? The world was splitting into 2 technological spheres, and the cost of choosing wrong was enormous. Into this fragmentation walked India. Not as a victim, as a strategist. India's strategic autonomy is not isolationism. It is not neutrality. It is something more sophisticated. The deliberate refusal to allow any external power to determine India's strategic choices. Its roots go back to Jawaharlal Nehru's non-aligned movement of the 1950s, born in the shadow of Cold War bipolarity. India, alongside Egypt, Yugoslavia, and Indonesia, refused to be a pawn in the American-Soviet competition. They called it non-alignment, but it was always more than that. It was the assertion that post-colonial nations had interests of their own. Modern India inherited that instinct, but weaponized it with economic weight. Today, India is simultaneously a member of Quad, the anti-China security grouping with the US, Australia, and Japan, while continuing to buy Russian oil at discount prices. It is deepening defense ties with Washington, while refusing to join Western sanctions on Moscow. It is hosting Apple's supply chain migration from China, while developing its own domestic chip program. It is negotiating free trade agreements with the European Union, while expanding the BRICS payment architecture to reduce dollar dependence. Every major power sees India as a potential ally. None can claim it as a vassal. Nothing illustrated India's strategic calculation more starkly than its response to the Ukraine war. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, The Western alliance moved with unprecedented speed. Sanctions froze Russian assets, disconnected Russian banks from SWIFT, and attempted to collapse the Russian economy. Western companies exited Moscow en masse. The message from Washington and Brussels to the world was clear. Choose your side. India did not choose. Indian External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar captured the logic with characteristic directness. Europe's problems, he argued, are not the world's problems. While Europe had depended on Russian energy for decades, it was now demanding that India, which had never been part of that dependency, never participated in that architecture, sacrifice its own economic interests to enforce a Western strategic goal. India's response was market logic. Russia was offering oil at a steep discount, sometimes 30% below market. For a nation that imports 80% of its crude oil requirements, this was not a moral question. It was arithmetic. India's oil imports from Russia went from near zero before the war to nearly 40% of total imports by late 2023. India refined that oil, re-exported petroleum products to Europe at market price, and quietly became a critical node in the very energy trade the West was trying to disrupt. The geopolitical consequence was profound. India had positioned itself as essential infrastructure in the global energy system, a buyer Russia needed, a refiner Europe depended on, and a partner that neither the United States nor China could afford to alienate. If Russia represents India's leverage over the Western coalition, China represents India's most complex and consequential strategic challenge. The two nations share a 300-400-kilometer border, much of it contested. In June 2020, soldiers from both countries fought a brutal hand-to-hand combat in the Galwan Valley of eastern Ladakh, the bloodiest border clash since 1967. 20 Indian soldiers and an unknown number of Chinese troops died. The relationship since then has been defined by what Indian strategic analysts call competitive coexistence, neither war nor partnership, a state of permanent managed tension. Economically, the contradiction is acute. China is India's second-largest trading partner. Indian markets are flooded with Chinese goods, electronics, solar panels, machinery, pharmaceuticals. India runs a massive trade deficit with Beijing, and yet India has banned over 300 Chinese mobile applications, restricted Chinese investment in critical sectors, and joined military exercises explicitly designed to counter Chinese naval expansion in the Indo-Pacific. The strategic logic is clear. India does not have the economic capacity to decouple from China the way the United States is attempting to. But it is also unwilling to subordinate its sovereignty to Beijing's vision of regional hierarchy. So India does both. It trades, it competes, it hedges, it builds alternatives. The India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor, announced at the G20 Summit India hosted in New Delhi in 2023, is explicitly designed as infrastructure competition with China's Belt and Road Initiative. It offers a different model, one where borrowing nations retain ownership, where the contracts are transparent, and where the strategic objective is connectivity rather than dependency. The 2023 G20 Summit in New Delhi was a masterclass in how India sees itself in the New World Order. India insisted on renaming the summit's key document to include the African Union as a permanent member, a move that simultaneously expanded the G20's legitimacy and positioned India as the voice of the global South. It positioned the summit not as a Western-led institution, but as a genuine forum of human civilization. The Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, made a deliberate choice at that summit. India would not be the summit where the Ukraine war dominated every agenda item. It would be the summit where development, climate finance, digital public infrastructure and food security, issues that matter to the two-thirds of the world living outside the Western Alliance, took center stage. It worked. The New Delhi Declaration was adopted by consensus, including from Russia and China, in a diplomatic achievement that had eluded previous G20 presidencies in Rome and Bali. India had done something remarkable. It had turned a Western-created institution into a platform for civilizational pluralism. The message was clear. The world is not a binary choice between American liberal democracy and Chinese authoritarian capitalism. There is a third path, and India intends to lead it. Behind India's geopolitical maneuvering lies an economic transformation that is quietly redrawing the map of global commerce. The Reserve Bank of India has been actively promoting the internationalization of the rupee, allowing bilateral trade in rupees rather than requiring dollar conversion. India has signed rupee trade agreements with Russia, UAE, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and several other nations. This is not an attempt to replace the dollar. India's economy and financial markets are not yet at that scale. But it is an attempt to reduce transaction friction, lower dollar dependency for regional trade, and build the institutional infrastructure for a more multipolar monetary system. Simultaneously, India's Unified Payments Interface, the digital payment system that now processes more transactions per month than Visa and MasterCard combined in India, is being exported globally. UPI is now live in Singapore, France, UAE, Mauritius, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and Bhutan. India is offering its digital public infrastructure as a model for developing nations. In the digital economy, India has built something extraordinary, a comprehensive digital stack. Aadhaar for identity, UPI for payments, DigiLocker for documents, ONDC for e-commerce, that allows a nation of 1.4 billion to conduct economic activity without depending on American platforms or Chinese hardware. This is digital sovereignty in practice, and it is being replicated from Southeast Asia to Africa. Here is the truth that most Western analysts miss when they observe India's behavior and call it contradictory, opportunistic, or strategically incoherent. India is not confused. India is not indecisive. India is running a long game. Every major civilization that survived the 20th century did so by understanding that in a world of great powers, the most dangerous thing you can be is dependent. Dependent on a single security patron. Dependent on a single currency. Dependent on a single supply chain. Dependent on a single technological ecosystem. India's entire foreign policy architecture, the multiple partnerships, the refusal of alliances, the insistence on autonomy, is designed to ensure that no single external actor can switch off the Indian economy, threaten Indian security, or determine Indian governance from the outside. And as the world order fractures, as the United States retreats from multilateralism, as China overreaches, as Europe struggles with its own coherence, India's positioning becomes more valuable, not less. The nations that want to access India's 1.4 billion consumers, its growing military capability, its technology sector, its renewable energy market, its critical minerals, its diaspora networks, they must come to India on India's terms. That is not weakness masquerading as strategy. That is strength operating as patience. The world is breaking. The old rules are no longer enforced. The old institutions are no longer trusted. The old alliances are no longer sufficient. In this disorder, most nations face a terrible choice. Align with America and accept its conditions. Align with China and accept its hierarchy, or risk irrelevance in the margins. India has chosen a fourth path, not because it is indifferent to the disorder, but because it understands, with the memory of a civilization that has survived every empire that ever tried to conquer it, that the nations which endure are not the ones that win any particular battle, they are the ones that are still standing when the battle is over. India is building for that moment, quietly, strategically, on its own terms, because in the New World Order, or rather, in the New World Disorder, the most powerful position is not military supremacy, it is indispensability.